Georgia is now the tip of the spear. And what I mean by that is that Georgia is leading a nationwide movement to reform election laws. These reforms are underway all over the place. According to the Brennan Center, which has been tracking this stuff, lawmakers in 47 states have introduced 361 bills for voter integrity. Of those bills, 55 are moving through legislatures in 24 states. 29 have gone through one chamber, and 26 of them have made it through committee. 5 bills have already been signed into law. So this is an important movement to, you may say, secure the vote. Now, from the left's point of view, it is restricting the vote. Not really. How do you restrict the vote? Well, they say, well, voter ID. Voter by requiring an ID, you're restricting the vote. Well, let's think about it. How come voter ID is racist, but ID in every other context is not racist? Travel ID isn't racist, apparently. American Airlines and Delta aren't restricting travel access for minorities by asking people to show an ID. When you purchase a gun, you need an ID. How come that's not racist? When you make a medical appointment, you need an ID. That's evidently not racist. Aren't they restricting medical access? Latinos and blacks won't be able to get proper medical care. When you buy liquor, you need an ID to prove that you're a certain age. How come that's not racist? When you do transactions with the government, when you get welfare, when you get stimulus checks, Social Security, you need to show ID. When you deal in credit card transactions, you're often asked for your ID. So here's something very mysterious. Evidently, ID is non-racist in all these other contexts, but becomes racist, mysteriously, in the one context where the left really doesn't want to have ID requirements at all. They say, well, there are people who have real trouble getting an ID. Who does? Who really has trouble getting an ID? Who can't get an ID? In fact, if there was a problem of people getting an ID, make it kind of easier to get an ID. Make it possible for people in all walks of life to have easy access to getting an ID. Now, around the world, I can envision people who don't have ID. In the outskirts of India, there are these sort of tribal peoples who live in remote areas. They live by their own laws. They can't get ID. If you go to the Amazon rainforest, you literally have people who live sort of in trees and in forests. They're not part of mainstream society. They don't have ID. But apart from those segments of people in the world, it's really hard for me to think of groups in America that can't get an ID. This is a little preposterous. So why is it the left so eager so that to make it that you don't necessarily have to produce an ID? Well, if you don't have to produce an ID, you can vote multiple times in person. No ID. You can vote whether you live in the state or not. No ID. You can send in multiple mail-in ballots. No ID. You can vote on behalf of dead or fictitious people. Jane Austen. No ID. So no ID paves the way for all kinds of shenanigans. Now here's Governor Kemp in Georgia talking about the fact that the Georgia law, far from restricting access, far from being a legacy of Jim Crow, actually does a lot of reasonable things. Listen.
This bill that I just signed, is expanding the opportunity for people to vote early here in Georgia again, with even additional potential for people to vote on Saturday and Sunday. Is further securing the absentee ballot process by simply adding a photo ID requirement or number from your ID that will actually speed up the absentee balloting by mail process, which was very slow after this last election. Take the arbitrary part of that away. So really it's an election integrity bill, but also expands access. So it's kind of ironic that the president would be against that.
The Georgia law is by no means extreme. In fact, Georgia has voting requirements that are more open, more easy, or in some cases similar. Even the requirements that you do this and you do that, you produce an ID. This is similar to what occurs in many blue states. Let's look at a couple of examples. New York. New York allows for 10 days of in-person voting. Early in-person voting. Georgia allows for 17 days. New York requires voters casting absentee ballots to provide a reason why they can't come to the polls on election day. Georgia doesn't even do that. Delaware. Biden's from Delaware. He calls the Georgia voting law Jim Crow in the 21st century. Biden's home state of Delaware has never allowed early in-person voting. They're supposed to start doing it in 2022. But even when they do it, Georgia provides 7 more days of early in-person voting than in Delaware. Colorado. Major League Baseball says we're going to move the All-Star game from Georgia to Colorado. Are things any better in Colorado? No. Colorado basically allows for in-person voting, early in-person voting, 2 fewer days than Georgia. In Colorado, as in Georgia, you need photo identification if you're going to do mail-in balloting. New Jersey. Stacey Abrams appeared with the New Jersey governor, Phil Murphy, a Democrat. They were praising this new law in New Jersey, claiming that it contrasts favorably with the Georgia law. Not exactly. The New Jersey law allows 9 days of early in-person voting. Georgia has 17 days of early in-person voting. Rhode Island. The new Georgia law requires voters to request absentee ballots 11 days before the election. Rhode Island requires absentee ballot requests to be submitted 21 days before election day. And on you go. Go to Minnesota, another Democratic state. Minnesota requires a driver's license or other ID for absentee ballot verification. Wisconsin. The Badger State requires absentee ballot applications to include photo identification, and that's actually tougher than Georgia. Georgia doesn't require photo identification. It requires you provide your driver's license, the last 4 digits of your social security, or some other form of identification. So, bottom line of it is that Georgia's laws resemble, in many respects, and are more liberal, if you want to use that term, than in many other blue states. So for the left, it's all about making an example out of Georgia, and they're doing it in a hypocritical and dishonest way. You may say that the devil has gone down to Georgia in order to try to stymie. It's not just about Georgia. They know that if they can do a killer strike on the Georgia election reform, it will stymie election reform in all these other places. So what the left is up to, they're trying to stop the nationwide reform movement to make election laws accessible but also safe, to strike that balance between encouraging more people to vote, making it easier to vote, but at the same time making sure that people who are ineligible to vote don't vote. And that's what the left is most afraid of.